No one warned Hank Lawson that retirement would lead him straight into the jaws of the wild. A 67-year-old Vietnam veteran turned wildlife volunteer in Yellowstone, Hank had seen his share of storms, both on the battlefield and in life. But nothing prepared him for the moment he locked eyes with a limping cougar cub, standing alone near the tree line. Why was it there? And where was its mother? What Hank discovered next would change his view on animals and humanity forever. Love true wilderness stories with heart. Hit subscribe and follow for more jaw-dropping encounters that touch the soul and stir the mind. Just as Hank stepped forward, thinking the cougar cub might retreat into the woods, something remarkable happened. It didn't run. Instead, the small creature lifted itself onto its hind legs, its front paws hanging loosely in front of its chest, almost like it was pleading. Hank froze. He'd spent years volunteering at the Yellowstone Wildlife Rescue Center, but in all his time with wild animals, never had he seen one beg. The cub's golden eyes locked with his, full of something that looked eerily like hope. It let out a soft, trembling whine. Hank's heart pounded in his chest. "What in God's name are you trying to tell me, little one?" he whispered, his voice cracking as the crisp autumn wind rushed past his face. The cub didn't flinch. It stood there, swaying slightly, as though it was trying to hold itself up just long enough for Hank to understand. And then, Hank saw it. A small, fading scar just above the cub's front leg. His breath caught. 3 months ago, he treated a cougar cub brought in by rangers after a rock slide. The leg was mangled. He'd helped stitch it back together, gently nursing it through the pain. Could this be the same one? A wave of emotion surged through Hank. Gratitude, awe, fear. What had brought this cub back to him, alone in the woods? And why did it seem so desperate for help? He knew then, the story wasn't over. Hank dropped to one knee, his eyes locked on the cub's scar. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the rush of something deeper, recognition. This was the same cub, the one he'd wrapped in blankets, whispered to late into the night, feeding with trembling hands as it fought to survive. Back then, its mother had watched warily from the tree line, never stepping closer, but never leaving. And now, she was gone. The cub looked thinner, more weathered, alone. It took a cautious step back, then paused, glancing over its shoulder, then back at Hank, as if to say, "Follow me." He stood slowly, heart thudding like a drum in his chest. The autumn leaves crunched underfoot as he took a hesitant step forward. The cub turned and walked, limping slightly, into the deeper woods. Hank didn't ask questions. He didn't call for backup. He followed. What could drive a wild predator to seek help from a human? Again? Something was wrong. Hank's gut told him this wasn't about the cub anymore. Something worse had happened. And somehow he was the one it trusted to fix it. He didn't know what waited ahead. But he knew this. You don't ignore a second chance when the wild calls you by name. The cub moved with purpose, its small frame weaving between the trees as Hank followed. Carefully, instinctively, his boots brushing against damp leaves and broken twigs. The forest around him grew quieter, almost reverent, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Every few steps, the cub would pause, glancing back to make sure Hank was still there. That look, so full of urgency, so human in its desperation, tugged at something deep in Hank's chest. After nearly 10 minutes of walking, the trees opened into a small clearing. That's when he saw her, a full-grown cougar, lying on her side, panting heavily. Her fur was matted with blood near her back leg, where a cruel steel trap clung like a monster's jaws. Hank stopped dead in his tracks. His heart sank. It was the mother, the one who once trusted him enough to let him touch her cub. Now she was trapped, helpless, wounded, yet still breathing. The cub darted to her side, nudging her gently, whining softly. The mother lifted her head for just a moment, her eyes cloudy with pain, but when they locked onto Hank, they didn't show fear, just recognition, and something else, trust. Hank swallowed hard. He was no longer just a visitor in this wild place. He was needed. This wasn't just survival. It was a silent cry across species lines, a call for help, a call only he could answer. Hank didn't hesitate. Dropping his gear beside the cougar, he knelt slowly, making sure every movement was deliberate, non-threatening. The cub watched anxiously, hovering near its mother's head, its body tense like a drawn bow. The steel trap was massive, rusted, cruel, and clearly not meant for cougars, poachers. Hank clenched his jaw. He'd seen these kinds of traps before, designed to catch wolves or even bears, but they had no place in this protected stretch of land. The mother let out a soft growl, more from pain than aggression. "Easy, girl," Hank murmured, laying a weathered hand gently near her paw. She didn't pull back. In fact, her eyes, though glassy, locked onto his like she knew him. Somehow, through the fog of agony, she remembered the man who once saved her cub. Hank reached into his pack, pulling out a worn crowbar and a coil of rope. His hands worked fast but careful. Sweat trickled down his back despite the crisp air. One slip and she could bolt, or worse, lash out. But she didn't. She stayed still, trembling slightly, trusting him. With one final push, the trap snapped open. Blood oozed slowly from her leg, but the damage wasn't catastrophic. Hank exhaled sharply, almost in disbelief. She was free, but now the real work began. He turned to grab his field kit, but not before looking back at the cub. It was watching him with wide, glistening eyes. Hank opened his weather-beaten first aid kit, fingers moving with the steadiness of a seasoned medic. This wasn't his first emergency, and yet the weight of this moment felt different. He wasn't treating a human soldier on the battlefield, nor patching up a stray dog outside his Montana cabin. This was a wild cougar, a mother, and she was depending on him. He gently cleaned the wound, wincing as the mother flinched under his touch. The cub whimpered, nudging its mother's face, clearly trying to comfort her. "Hang in there, sweetheart," Hank whispered, dabbing antiseptic along the gash. The smell stung his nose, but the mother didn't move. Her breaths were labored, but steady. She was letting him help. He wrapped the leg carefully, using clean gauze and tape to secure it tight but not too tight. He'd learned that balance in war zones, where a bad wrap could cost a limb. When he finally sat back, his knees aching from crouching too long, he took a deep breath. The hardest part was over. The mother shifted slightly, testing the weight on her injured leg. She didn't roar. She didn't run. Instead, she slowly laid her head back down, eyes fluttering shut in what looked like, astonishingly, relief. The cub moved in close and curled beside her, its small body pressed protectively against hers. Hank sat there quietly, watching them breathe, feeling the wild world settle around them again. Hank stayed by their side for what felt like hours, though the sun had barely shifted through the golden branches overhead. Time seemed to pause in that quiet clearing. Just a man, a wounded mother, and her loyal cub. Every so often, the mother would lift her head, eyes fluttering open just enough to glance at Hank. There was no fear anymore, only a strange calm, like she understood she was safe. He finally stood, bones creaking, and stepped back to give them space. The cub looked up at him one last time, its eyes reflecting the same gratitude he'd seen in wounded soldiers who made it home. That kind of look stays with a man. It humbles you. It reminds you that compassion doesn't need a shared language, just a willing heart. The mother slowly pushed herself up. Her injured leg trembled, but she held her balance. Her cub was instantly at her side, rubbing against her gently, almost encouraging her to move. With painstaking care, she took a few slow steps, testing the bandaged paw. Hank held his breath. She didn't stumble. She kept walking, limping, yes, but she was walking. He watched them as they made their way toward the brush, the cub darting ahead, then circling back to nudge her forward. When she turned once, just before fading into the trees, Hank could swear, just for a second, she nodded. Word traveled fast. By the time Hank returned to the ranger station, the story of the begging cub and the wounded mother had already begun to spread among the local staff. Someone had spotted him from a distance, kneeling beside the wild cats. A drone camera from the park's boundary patrol had even captured part of the encounter. Within days, the footage, silent but powerful, circulated through Yellowstone's conservation community, and from there to the rest of the country. But it wasn't just about a man helping animals. It was something deeper, something spiritual. People saw the raw emotion in Hank's face, the way the cub had stood on its hind legs, the trust in the mother's eyes. Comment sections filled with words like divine, unreal, pure. Middle-aged folks, parents, even veterans wrote in. This reminded me of my time in service. This felt like a message from nature itself. Park visitors began requesting tours with the man who helped the cougar. Hank, once a quiet volunteer who preferred solitude, found himself surrounded by curious strangers, hanging on every word. He spoke humbly, never embellishing, always returning to one point. They came to me, not the other way around. Maybe we're not so different after all. That single act of compassion became legend, not just in Yellowstone, but across the country. Hank never sought attention, but in doing the right thing, he reminded people of something they'd forgotten, that even the wildest hearts can recognize kindness. These days, Hank Lawson doesn't just walk the trails of Yellowstone, he teaches them. Each time a group gathers, eyes wide and hearts open, he tells the story not with grandeur, but with the quiet reverence of a man who's been changed. He speaks of the cub who stood like a child asking for help, of the mother who, despite the pain, chose not to fight him off. He tells them how trust, when freely given across species, feels like nothing short of a miracle. Middle-aged visitors nod knowingly, some wipe away tears. Grandparents clutch their grandkids tighter. Veterans shake Hank's hand, saying, "That kind of courage, you don't learn that in books." Parents tell their children, "This is why we protect nature." What Hank teaches isn't just biology, it's humanity. He reminds folks that the wild is not just a backdrop, it's a mirror. A place where instincts don't lie, where love is raw and trust is earned, not given. He says, "That mother cougar didn't speak a word, but she told me everything I needed to know." And people listen. His story has sparked school programs, inspired nature documentaries, even brought poaching legislation back into public discussion. But Hank? He just smiles, tips his hat, and keeps walking the trail, always with a first aid kit in his pack, and a soft spot in his heart for anything that dares to trust a man. The story of Hank and the wild cougars reminds us that trust is a language deeper than words, a quiet, sacred bond built through presence, compassion, and consistency. In a world that often feels divided and disconnected, this tale teaches us that healing, whether between people or across species, begins when someone chooses to care without being asked. For older audiences who have lived through decades of change, pain, and beauty, Hank's journey reflects something timeless, that even in our later years, we still have the power to make an impact. Whether it's through lending a hand, listening deeply, or simply showing up when others have turned away, our small acts of kindness may become someone else's turning point. Nature doesn't forget compassion, and neither do people. In every stage of life, there's still purpose, still calling, still time to matter. And sometimes, the wildest places bring out the gentlest parts of who we are.